Morning, everyone. I'm just going to give it another minute or so because I can see the attendee numbers rising as people are logging into the session. Okay, just give it another minute. I can still see numbers ticking upwards. And then we'll kick off. Okay, well, we'll get started. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Institute and Faculty of Actuaries sessional meeting, looking at the public's attitude to the pensions freedoms and what this means in today's current cost of living crisis. Now, my name is Kelly Hurren, and I'll be chairing today's session. I'm a member of the IFoA's Pensions Research Subcommittee, and I'm responsible for co-leading the research that we'll be discussing today. In my day job, I'm a partner and head of member options at Aon. Now, I'm joined today by my three panelists. We've got Andrew Kemp, who is the chair of the IFoA's Personal Financial Planning Working Party, and he's co-leader of the research with me. We've got Sarah Luheshi, Deputy Director at the Pensions Policy Institute, and Joe Dabrowski, Deputy Director of Policy at the PLSA. Now, in total, we've got around 45 minutes today, and Andrew will start by spending 10 to 15 minutes or so talking us through the highlights of our research. And then we hope to spend around 30 minutes with you being able to ask your questions to our panelist. So whilst Andrew's talking, please start thinking of good questions to ask them. And if you would like to ask questions to our panel, you can do so by either typing your question into the chat function and I'll pick it up from there, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, and I'll introduce you and ask you to ask your question directly to our panel. So on that note, I'll hand over now to Andrew, who can tell us a bit about our research. I think you're on mute, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. In December 2020, our working party decided to revisit the public attitude to research that the IFoA undertook in 2016. Our instinct was that the freedoms were a good thing, particularly from a death benefits perspective. However, we were interested in whether anyone had any regrets over their decisions, whether people were getting advice, guidance, or were even aware of the changes. We wanted to draw some comparisons between the two surveys. A wider objective was to consider how the pension industry should respond to address any key observations. And since completing our research, the UK and the rest of the world has experienced a number of challenges, including a significant rise in the cost of living. This has led to workers making some very real decisions about the affordability of continuing to save, putting food on the table, or having the heating on. Our research doesn't explore those particular aspects, but they will feature in our discussions. So can everyone see the next slide? Just carry on, thank you. For a quick moment, let's roll back to 2015. Pension freedoms came along. A number of relatively subtle changes appeared in 2014, but from 2015, all of a sudden, DC savers had unrestricted access to their savings. For example, the ability to take uncrystallized fund pension lump sums without needing to designate funds into drawdown. We know a DC pension pot is a form of discretionary trust, but from this point onwards, that can continue in perpetuity, which is interesting, as you could have potentially have an infinitely lasting tax efficient legacy pending future legislation changes. So between the 28th and the 31st of January last year, YouGov conducted our survey through a sample of 185,000 residents of Great Britain, targeted at those over age 55. We saw a fairly balanced mix across the different age ranges shown, and it was helpful to see a higher weighting to the lower age brackets, being those who are more likely to have accessed their pensions since 2015 or were close to doing so. As well as age, gender, and class, the respondents were split by a whole range of demographics, including health, region of Great Britain, cohabitation status, and recent voting preferences. So the regional splits were, broadly speaking, 10% London, 10% Scotland, a third for the rest of the South, a fifth for the Midlands and Wales, and a quarter for the North. In terms of voting preferences, nearly 2/3 voted Conservative in the last general election, and broadly 60% voted Remain in the EU referendum. The respondents had a reasonable spread of different types and combinations of pension benefits, balanced across the different age brackets, as you can see. Around 1/5 of respondents had accessed their pensions since 2015, with the rest either not accessed at all or didn't have any pensions left to take. Perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise, but it was still disappointing that around a third of all respondents did not know what type of pension they had, if any. And perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise about the gender and the class differences that you can see here. These are stark differences within the don't know category.
So we'll just to make sure that everyone's still awake and you're following us, I thought we'll do a quick poll before we move on to the next question. So in a moment, Andrew's going to talk through kind of how aware the public were of the pensions freedoms. So before we do that, I thought we'll ask you, how aware do you think the over 55s in our survey were of the pensions freedoms that were introduced in 2015? So A, do you think they were very aware, knew what they were? B, they kind of knew something had changed, but didn't really quite know what that was, so they were vaguely aware. Or C, had absolutely no idea. So kind of how aware do you think the public were of those choices? And I'll give you a minute or so to answer that. Okay, so it looks like you've got probably slight lack of confidence there in everyone's understanding of the pensions freedoms. Only 6 of you thought that the public were likely to be very aware of the pensions freedoms. Most people saying, well, actually, I think they probably knew something had changed, but probably not that many people knowing really what had changed, vaguely aware. And 22% there saying, I think they had absolutely no idea. So Andrew, do you want to talk us through the answers there?
Sure. So looking at the pie chart, you can see that around half of respondents were aware of the new rules. Just under a sixth had some vague awareness, and the rest, just over a third, had no idea. So it's very different to what we just saw in terms of your responses. But as you might expect, there were some very real differences when you compare the responses between the different age groups. So the 55 to 64-year-olds were materially more aware compared to those in the over 75 group, by a difference of about 20%. So perhaps the wake-up packs are having some impact here. To see trends with the previous survey, we kept a number of the questions consistent. This was one of these, and the responses demonstrated a significant reduction in awareness since 2015, as you can see down here. In terms of perception, whether the reforms were a good thing or a bad thing, this question was only asked to those who were aware that something had changed. Just over half the respondents saw the freedoms as a good thing, and this was much higher than in the 2016 survey. And there was an equivalent fall in those who felt it was a bad idea, from around 30% to 15% here. We didn't see any standout differences in gender or class, but there was a large proportion who felt indifferent, potentially those with only defined benefit or state pensions who are impacted by the freedoms. There were noticeable difference in the age brackets, as you can see on the right. The younger respondents were most likely to think the freedoms is a good thing, which is interesting for what we found a bit later. So when it comes to reviewing pension savings, accessing DC, or deciding whether to keep or transfer out of DB, we wanted to understand how many were getting advice, noting that those with cash equivalent transfer values over 30,000 must take regulated advice. The chart on the left shows how respondents accessed help or advice, and the chart on the right shows the reasons why 1/3 did not. As you can see, men were much more likely to take regulated advice, but at the same time, more likely to say that they did not need any advice or guidance relative to women. Females were more likely to access advice from generic sources, such as what was at the time pensions-wise. 40% of all the respondents did not seek any kind of formal advice or guidance. We did not see any significant differences in the demographics. As you might expect, the main barriers were cost and knowing how to find an advisor that they could trust. Some examples of what people said for other reason why they did not access help or advice were company information was comprehensive alongside their own knowledge. They were an ex-financial advisor or worked in financial services, or they were happy with their own judgment. Maybe some themes of overconfidence there. We felt that in the current environment, it's more important than ever for people to access some form of support and for the pension industry to help. When we were designing the questions, we wanted to explore a number of different areas without any specific bias. This question was meant as a check to see how well people were planning, and for interest, how much people thought their future regular spending would be met from their pension savings. Around 1/3 didn't know, which is worrying because either they had not planned how much they were going to spend, or they didn't know what level of income their pension could provide. Annoyingly, this is consistent with the proportion who did not even know what type of pension they had. The class split results were almost exactly mirror the gender splits that you can see there. Another interesting difference was between the two age brackets in the chart on the right. So those aged 65 to 74 broadly mirrored those for the 75 plus, so we grouped them together here. In summary, those who have planned and are aware of what they have, so females and younger respondents expect their pension savings to cover a significantly lower proportion of their expenditure compared to males and the older respondents. So another way of looking at it is to say that women and younger respondents were less likely to know, i.e. they haven't planned or didn't know what they have compared to men and older respondents. Either way, it's perhaps reflected of the pensions gender gap and workplace pensions shifting from DB to DC. The last two questions of the survey looked at two specific points on DC pensions. When asked, to what extent do you feel you understand all the charges you are paying in DC pensions? Just over 60% felt that they had an understanding, but that means around 40% didn't understand. The split between males and females is significant. When asked if they know what their DC pensions were invested in, 10% said currently 100% in cash. That was broadly consistent across the demographics. The other options were shown here on the right. Worryingly, 70% of respondents did not know what they were invested in. What I found interesting here was that just under 30% said no, but to have an advisor. I'd be bringing into question what the advisor is doing unless they use a discretionary service. But even then, the individual should really know what they own in terms of equities and who they're lending their money to in terms of bonds. Knowing what you're invested in is always important, but as we've seen recently, for those in lifestyling arrangements who have been switched into cash and gilts as a default, those approaches haven't worked out so well unless they've taken the traditional approach of max cash and annuity, in which case they've been hedged correctly, assuming perfect timing there. Going back to the start, I said we were interested if there was any regret in the decisions that have been made. When asked if you could go back to when you accessed your pensions, would you have done anything differently? 71% said no, which is clearly very encouraging, implies no big signs of regret. Nearly 10% said they would have planned their retirement earlier to better understand their options. Intriguingly, this was more significant for those in the 65 to 74 age bracket. And finally, when asked about their biggest worry or challenge when planning retirement, the responses were across the age brackets as shown. Males and females answered reasonably consistently, but the age group response perhaps disagree with what we saw a few slides ago. The younger groups have respectively higher fear of running out and admit to a greater lack of understanding, while at the same time, they felt the freedoms were a good thing. So other responses to this question had themes around inflation, having enough to live off, poor annuity rates, so that's a bit different now. They didn't plan, dying before they get to enjoy it, government changing the goalpost with respect to state pension age, advice costs, the government constantly fiddling with taxes and rules, which is seen in abundance since we ran this survey. Okay, so that's the end of the survey highlights. Thank you for your attention. Our full research paper will be available via the Working Party's website very shortly. I'm going to hand back to Kelly now for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. So just a reminder, if you want to ask any questions to our panel, you can do so by just clicking the raise hand button at the bottom, or just type in your question directly into the chat, and one way or another, I'll pick up your question and put that to the panel. Just to kick off a few questions, I guess, that I've got first of all. So I'll ask this one, Joe, to you, if that's okay. And it's almost starting a bit at the basics and towards the start of that research there. Now, actually, I think the real picture was slightly more optimistic than what our attendees here on the webinar thought, but still around a third of respondents didn't know about the pensions freedoms, and 25% of 55 to 64-year-olds say that their biggest worry with retirement is running out of money. So how do you think we improve that?
Thanks, Kelly. And I think thanks, Andrew, for the research run through. I think it's really interesting. I think, sadly, it's not too surprising to me that people, a large proportion of people aren't aware of their pension details, that they might have access to freedom of choice and some of the other choices that they might have. I think we know that people have typically tended not to pay a great deal of attention to their pension until they come close to retirement and then begin to examine some of their options, and you know, that does potentially leave some people in a difficult place if they've not been saving enough. And it also means that people potentially make poor choices then when they get to retirement. You know, that's one of the reasons for the interventions around the investment pathways, for example, in order to stop people actually just taking all their money, putting it in the bank and forgetting about it, which some people still do. Of course, but I think, you know, we have to try and tackle this. I think it's quite a difficult question as well, given the philosophical move that we've made in pension savings. We've moved to inertia, and a lot of the system is built around that. So kind of activating people essentially at the right time is an interesting challenge, but one we do need to do a little better on, for sure. I think there are a number of measures where we can try and help, and clearly some of those are kind of in train. So the pensions dashboards will help people access and see a display of all their pensions in one place, hopefully, and that will help people just get that grip of what have I got. How well they understand that is a separate question. There are clearly things like the PLSA's retirement living standards, which are intended to help people just get a easy to grasp sense of what they need for their income in retirement. And then there are lots of other things, I think, like pension attention campaign, which is really focused on trying to kind of wake people up a little bit, and the kind of data that we saw that worked pretty well in year one, and we need to kind of keep building on that for year two. wider things like financial education through schools, employers, they're always a sort of silver bullet that we talk about, but whether they'll truly make the difference is hard to say. I think a lot of the other stuff around is really helpful. So the kind of free, popular advice that people can get from maps. We know that people who use the service really like it. The results are good. The customer feedback is good. But not everybody who's eligible for advice goes to take it. So we need to kind of activate those people in different ways too. And then also addressing some of these challenges around the kind of financial advice, guidance, boundary, which we know is a little bit tough and blurry for people. So that kind of extra support that can come in there. So I think there's a lot to do. We need to kind of keep plugging away at it. But I think we also kind of can't overestimate how much improvement we can make on what people want. I think people often want just things to happen simply and for them in their pension without having to do a lot of thinking. The jargon is difficult, it's complex, it's technical. So as much of that as we can remove as possible, that would be great. And I think some of that is also about how do we get to genuine product innovation and support for people when they come to accumulation. But we might come back to that. I thought it was also interesting to see in this service that's the kind of ongoing gender bias that men won't say that they don't know anything and are overconfident in all their savings and what they do know. So maybe we need to tackle that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I quite like when I looked at those statistics. I don't know if I was surprised or not to see those statistics when the results came in. I guess so. Everything that you're talking about there, Joe, is really around engagement and how do we improve engagement. And I know, Sarah, when we've been talking about this, you kind of need to think, what do we really mean by engagement and how do we measure that?
Absolutely. I know that we want to try and ensure people have a full understanding of what it is they're doing with their future retirement income. But I still think there's a huge challenge that there is no single definition of what we mean by engagement. And I'm delighted that one of the slides said this is the personal views of the presenters, because as the PPI, we don't lobby or have policy positions. But personally, I get really frustrated when the solution to more engagement is just let's send some more communication, because that's not actually addressing the underlying issue of a lack of willingness to engage or a lack of financial capability to do so. So it would be helpful if we actually had a definition of what we meant, and not only that, measure it. What is a measure for more engagement? I've been chatting to people in the industry who said, oh, we set us, and it's the old adage of you do what you're going to be measured on. So they had a measure of more people accessing the website and spending longer on it. And the person I was talking to was absolutely cynical about it. He said, we could actually make the website so dense and impossible to navigate that they're going to spend hours on it because they're so lost. But we'll have hit our internal measurement of more people spending more time on our website. So it is a case of trying to think through this more carefully. And I think what we also need to think about is, why are we engaging people? And what outcome, what behaviour do we want to see from people doing that? So I agree with Joe, dashboards will be a tremendous step forward when you can see all your pensions in one place. I still have a query in my head, amongst others, about, so what do we want people to do as a result of it? So once they've actually been on the dashboard, it's that so what question. And I'm not confident we've actually answered what that is at the moment. And yes, I'm very aware that my PPI boss is also the principal for the pensions dashboard. So I'm speaking with a PPI hat on here, believe me. This is the reason why this is so pertinent for me, is that we're looking to try and do some research specifically to see how other countries have tried to deal with this, and whether countries who are a little bit further on in the DC journey than we are have got any lessons that we can try and read across. So places like Australia, Chile, funnily enough, but also examples of how not to try and improve engagement. Just a quick aside, Sweden did a huge push to try and get people more engaged in their investment choices. at the point that the market then collapsed, and then they didn't do any follow-up communication or engagement to help people understand why and what they could do at that point. So I think we need to be, as Joe's already pointed out, consistent in the plans that we do have, and make certain that people have got places that they can go and find the information from.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, between you and Joe there's lots of really great points that I think we need to think about, and certainly the comment about, you know, just measuring number of clicks on a website is certainly not a great measure of how engaged people really are in their pensions. And your point about the pensions dashboard, I think I do agree. I think that would be a great way for people to start to learn about pensions they have out there, but I think it's really important for people to understand almost all the things the dashboard won't do, so that you're thinking about, you know, how you might fill in those gaps and really help people you know, understand what's on there. I guess coming to understanding, Andrew, I know that in your role as a paraplanner for a financial advice firm, you obviously see firsthand members coming to you. You see the impact of some of this lack of understanding. And I guess in the current environment where cost of living is obviously you know, a big factor in people's minds, are you seeing any differences in behaviour or of people that are coming to you at the moment for advice?
There's a couple of points there. So yes, I see varying levels of understanding. Difficulty is pensions is a very broad subject and potentially very complex financial planning. So it's not a surprise. Generally speaking, our clients have a reasonable understanding of the basics and tend to come to us when there's a particularly technical issue involving one or other of pension allowances, or perhaps a lack of understanding about how death benefits work. So in terms of behavioural changes, we tend to see people shifting towards drawing more from non-pension sources first. But in terms of your question around concerns in the current climate, there's more than usual short-termism focus on investment performance. The answer there is to try and sort of coach behaviours and shift the focus from the past towards the future. Consider the things that are within the scope of their control. In terms of specifics, maybe a client has planned a large or a one-off capital withdrawal from their long-term savings, and we might see them delaying these or perhaps phasing them out. Similarly, another client's looking at postponing their retirement until later in the year because of a concern of starting unsecured income withdrawals at the point when the markets dip. So that's demonstrating a clear understanding of various things to do with investments and what the markets are doing at the moment. But another way of looking at this, some other clients are looking whether or not they should be paying back their mortgages or overpaying sooner or quicker. For example, rather than overpaying into their pension or making pension contributions. So in a low interest rate environment where higher rate income tax is available, making pension contributions is normally an obvious win, but now it's less obvious, particularly with the volatility and uncertainty in the rates. So there's similar examples like that. So not so much from the cost of living, but bearing in mind the cohort of those who are being advised generally sort of insulated a little bit from that. So it's more about how much they can put in. One client, interestingly, he came to us and asked how much. He asked us to review his current workplace arrangement in terms of levels of contributions and what he was invested in. It was interesting when we found out the details of the scheme, because the default fund was a lifestyling arrangement that targeted towards drawdown. Now, that particular arrangement didn't provide drawdown. And when you look at the underlying funds, it was rated more like a low middle risk. When you're 20 years away from retirement, so perhaps the trustees were being a little cautious there. But yeah, that's some examples of why they might be coming to us.
No, thanks, Andrew. That's interesting, and I guess that's a useful prompt that, you know, default arrangements, as useful as they are, I think, you know, you need to pay attention to those, and they might not necessarily be the right thing for everybody. We're starting to get now quite a few questions coming in via the chat function, so I'm going to pick up some of those. This first one I'm going to put to you, Joe. I think it's for you. So 2 questions. First, does the PLSA have any stats about the impact of the Pay Your Pension Some Attention campaign? And second, the DWP appears to be favouring the self-service pensions dashboard over the Pensions Wise service in their planning, which involves actually discussing your situation with a guidance specialist. And do the panel have any views on that? So I guess first question, Joe, to you on the Pay Your Pension Some Attention campaign.
Yes, thanks, Kelly, and thanks for the question. I've got a whole slide deck of stats on the Pension Attention campaign and how successful it has been. I'm happy to share those privately, separately. We've put out some kind of public comments on some of them too. I don't have them right in front of me this second, but I can try and recall a few of them. And I can probably dig them out from my files in the meantime, so you can come back to me. But I think one of the things that we do know is that roughly kind of 1 in 5 of the population remembered and recognised the campaign when we tested with them at the very end. You know, had it made a difference? Had they recognised? Had they done something? Had they looked at it? And we saw a lot of information in relation to kind of people being prompted to have a conversation with their friends, with their family, to go and check their pension, and also to maybe inquire with their scheme about what was going on and asking questions. I'll dig up some of the stats, and I'm happy to share them. I can probably put some links in too. But yeah, really positive overall, and we're really kind of keen to get started earlier for year 2. We started year 1 in a pretty rushed fashion, so we're giving ourselves a little bit of a longer lead in time, and we're going to hopefully be even bigger and even more successful. And
certainly hope that we don't have an LDI crisis, which happened right in the middle of the previous and the Queen's death.
We had 2 crises in the middle of the campaign, which we were very pleased to be able to navigate. But
she can't die twice, at least.
I guess the second question there, I don't know, Sarah, whether you want to answer that one.
I'm happy to, because I think they both come under the guise of maps. A pension dashboard is trying to do something different to Pension Wise. And I suspect, because pension dashboard is an awful lot in the news at the moment because of rules coming out and various announcements, that it probably seems like it's being favoured. But I must admit, and I don't know if Joe has the same experience, in my conversations with DWP and with maps, there is no intentional bias. I think it's just where they're at in the project to try and get dashboards live. Pension guidance, Pension Wise is getting an awful lot of attention and a lot of promotion. And I think, if memory serves me right, people are now being asked to set up the appointment, the providers, when people are coming up to 55. So it's more a default for people to have those appointments set. So I think they're serving different purposes, and I don't see any bias coming out from the government at the moment.
Thank you. And someone's commented on here, sort of on the subject of dashboards, that they could be a two-edged sword. So they'll obviously give members lots more information about their pension benefits, but might also bring to light just how little some people have got in retirement, which might be a shock for quite a few people there, and potentially a challenge for the government as well. And this is where they need to refer to PLSA retirement living standards to assess what they might need. Yeah, absolutely. I guess come into the group of people who don't access any kind of guidance or advice. So in the survey, we had 40% of people don't seek any kind of guidance or advice with their retirement planning, and only 1/3 of the respondents took formal regulated advice. So Joe, what do you think we need to do as an industry just to make that advice more accessible to retirees?
Yeah, I think as we see some of the challenges, a lot of people are put off by various things, including not wanting to ask the question, the accessibility of the advice, and also the kind of cost of advice. I think some of that is also due to kind of the lack of prevention rather than kind of at the cure point. So we have the people coming cold to retirement. They're pretty sort of ill-informed in many cases, and then they're kind of nervous about taking advice. They think about their pension pot and they think, where do I go to get this? Do I want to ask the question, how much is it going to cost me, and who can I get it from? And then have those concerns that kind of pop up that came through from the survey. How do I find somebody that I can trust? Oh gosh, it looks really expensive in comparison to what I might normally pay for something, even if it's a small percentage of the overall fraction. People paying several £1,000s for advice, that feels like a lot to people kind of front up, especially if they think, well, maybe I can do it myself, if they're a little bit kind of overconfident. So I think we need to try and make sure that people appreciate beforehand that they might need to think about kind of financial planning a little bit more. We need to have the free financial tools available to people as best they can, whether that's through Money Helper, whether that's through support that can be subsidized, supported through employers or schemes, through signposting. Lots of employers, lots of schemes do that kind of material. Maybe it's not as taken up as it could be. And then a lot of it is about trying to tackle the other issues. It's, I would expect over, the coming years, decade, for a lot of fintech advice to try and take out some of the costs for people with simpler products or simpler needs. We also probably need to look at how do you get make sure you get kind of value, and also people understand the benefits of taking that kind of wider financial advice when they've got a bigger pot. I think one of the things that was surprising when the RRR came out several years ago was that even with people with fairly large pots of over 100,000, a lot of them weren't taking advice either, and were kind of off-put by some of these same issues. So there is a resistance, and there's a sort of fear of going down this avenue. So we need to remove a lot of those barriers. I think also probably worth recognizing that the advice guidance boundary doesn't really help a lot at the moment, because the boundary feels pretty hard to people. It also feels pretty worrying for schemes, employers to kind of, there's a big grey bit in the middle where people think, well, dip a toe, but I might get slammed by some massive fine, or I'll be doing something illegal and it will all come back to me. So I think verge on the kind of side of caution, just, well, I won't do it, and leave it to the person. It's their responsibility under this new world. So I think that causes a problem. I know that the Treasury and the FCA seem to be kind of open to looking at that. So if we can tackle some of that, that would be good. Also, it really would help ensure that people in a trust-based world can provide support to people a little bit more, and also employers, because people tend to trust their employer. They feel like their employer is not going to send them off somewhere weird, not going to try and scam them. Why would they? So if you can make that bridge a little easier, that would work. But I think a lot of it is also about getting that product, because if people don't want to make these choices, we need to make sure that they can essentially default into a world where they get good outcomes without having to think about it. And I think that's why we think there's a lot of room for improvement in the decumulation space around kind of product design. I should probably also say I found some of the stats now on my slide deck, so I can come back to you on pension attention information at some point too.
I guess just on the subject of product design, just because that links to a question that somebody's asked and they've directed it at you, Joe, so I'll ask it to you. So you've mentioned that there could be some product innovation to deal with some of these challenges, and the person's asked, have you thought how this might develop? So for example, could there be a role for collective DC schemes in retirement to help people with the fear of running out?
So I think there is potentially a role for collective DC schemes. We've obviously seen the Royal Mail example developing. I think government has an intention to look at wider measures, and probably quite soon. So I think look out for that in the very near future. So I think that is a role, CDC in decumulation, but also other decumulation products, I think, and essentially also products that work in a different and bolder way than the kind of investment pathways, and the way that there's a lot of innovation happening in the market now. Some of the bigger mass trusts are already looking to provide these through and through products. So I'd hope that would evolve. It clearly needs a little bit of space for innovation, as well as making sure the right protections are in place. And that's one of the reasons when we looked at this a couple of years ago and came up with our guided retirement income choices, that we thought it was important to have kind of governance thresholds, product appropriate design thresholds as well, so that you can make sure that even in this kind of world where the product is likely to evolve it's likely to change. You actually what good looks like is well established and probably on a statutory footing to avoid the sort of bit of the Wild West that we saw after the freedom and choice first came out, and because we don't want to have to fix a problem later. And also, I guess, learning from it worked out well, but when Master Trust authorization came 5 years after Master Trusts were up and running, it might have been better to have a bit more structure at the beginning.
Thank you. And I guess if you've got your stats there, do we want to circle back to that question while you've got those?
Yeah, I can just give some campaign highlights. So as I mentioned, so 19% of people recalled the campaign at the end. So that's 7.9 million adults. Looks like we inspired 2.65 million employees to pay their pension some attention. If we kind of look at it on a kind of macro level, 91% of those 19% who fully recalled everything right at the end had taken some action on their pension. And I think we had close to 30 million pieces of advertising impressions and kind of over 150 kind of wider pieces of media coverage, as well as I think a lot of support from parliamentarians, the industry as a whole, and overall. So that's a quick flash of some of the highlights, but I've got a lot more information for those who are interested. Please do to reach out. We're happy to look for new partners to work with in the coming year.
Thank you. I guess this is not really a question, more a statement, but I guess I'm going to put this towards you, Sarah, to see whether you've got any thoughts on this. So somebody's commented that one big problem here with pensions is the short-termism of HM Treasury and the long-term nature of pensions. So there's lots of short-term tinkering with things like pensions tax relief to help government finances, and what it really needs is some cross-party agreement to prevent this and help things for the long term. So what do you think? How do you think we can improve some of those things?
Wouldn't it be great if we had a long-term plan and a cohesive plan, and that what we don't end up is decisions made by HMT affecting what should be going on in DWP? So yes, from the anonymous attendee, that short-term tinkering plays havoc with both the industry and what we have to cope with, but also plays havoc with the person on the street. We know that the level of trust in the industry and the government is low, and this constant changing of rules doesn't help. And it does mean that, I think, as you've seen from the survey results and the audience results, the level of knowledge in what is going on is remarkably low at times. And changing tax, changing rules and regulations, I don't think is helping us at all. So some stability would be nice. And I look forward to that period of time.
Yeah, we certainly haven't had much stability recently, have we?
Well, to be fair, Guy Opperman was in post longer than Sir Steve Webb, which were the two of our longer serving pensions ministers recently. So we had moved away from the revolving door of Parliament for a period. Long may Laura Trott remain in post and give us some consistency.
Thank you. And so there's another question here that was one of the first questions that popped up, and I'll put this one at Andrew because it's a question about our survey. So the question asked, did we test what people actually knew rather than what they thought they knew?
In terms of, yeah, there's a very it's a very broad question. No, we wanted to, when we were designing the survey, we were sure initially whether or not we were going to follow up with sort of an interview style, or have a tick box at the end saying, would you mind if we follow up with you? But no, we didn't quiz them about if they knew what they were talking about.
Yeah, we didn't send them a test.
No,
test.
no, exactly. But there was another question a little bit further down about survey includes people who would have taken pension benefits some time ago. Many would have bought annuities. Were you able to segment the group who had accessed the pension under the new regime? And there was a specific question in the survey. Have you accessed any pensions since the government introduced the new rules? And we've got all the splits for that. And the answer for yes, but that was 21%. So around, what, 400 people?
Yeah, I think the challenge with testing whether people actually know what they've answered is, if you ask somebody, do you regret your decision? I think very few people would be willing to admit that they regret what they did. So it's a difficult question to ask people, but we were kind of, and to be honest, many people might not know that until they're many years into their retirement anyway.
Exactly,
so
yeah, I was going to say that.
So I'm conscious of time. Thank you everybody for all of your questions. I think that's been a really, really interesting discussion, really good set of questions there. And I'm pleased that we had lots of questions. I've learned that we've got a probably slightly more pessimistic audience here than what we had of our public that we interviewed for our survey. But to summarise, I think what we've seen today is that freedom and choice and flexibility is valued by people coming up to retirement. But there is a definite admission of a lack of understanding and awareness about how to get help. So I think that's the challenge for the pensions industry, about how we bridge that gap and help make sure that people do make the right decisions for their retirement. And as we've all discussed today, there's many things that are helping with that, but obviously still quite a lot to do there. So I hope that you all found today's session interesting. There will be the full research available on the Institute's website if you'd like to read that later. But thank you everybody for listening to the session, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.